Eva Vlaardingerbroek is a social and political commentator from the Netherlands, and she recently put out a tweet, not specifically about antinatalism by name, but very related to it. And I think there was a lot of silliness in it, and I think it would be worth going through it, given that it's gotten quite a lot of views. At the time of recording this, it's got 5.5 million views. Elon Musk has replied to it, and I've only seen one antinatalist response to it. Now, I have not extensively gone through the comments, so maybe there are more and I've missed them, but I saw that Stop Having Kids has done a response to it. But let's get into the actual tweet now. So the tweet itself is, "There is nothing more narcissistic, degenerate, and evil to me than people who propagate abortion or not having children because of climate change or the current state of the world. If you think your life is hard or the world is too unfair to bring a child into, think for one damn second about the lives our ancestors lived and how it never even would have crossed their minds to kill their own babies for a second. Get a grip, you weak-minded morons." So the first thing I want to say is that Ava speaks about abortion and not having children. Now, I want to kind of separate these two things to begin with. So I think the better thing to do is just not conceive in the first place, obviously. Like, put barriers in place so that that won't happen. Because obviously someone who isn't conceived cannot be harmed by their non-conception in any way, obviously. They don't exist. But once a fetus starts to grow and once they start to gain sentience, well, then they gain their own interests and they come into being in some sort of morally relevant way, and their interests have to be balanced off the mother, etc., etc. So it becomes a lot more complicated situation. So I want to pass these two things apart. Not having kids and just not conceiving someone is very different in a moral sense to abortion once the fetus is sentient. Before the fetus is sentient, I think it is morally the same thing. But once they're sentient, it then becomes much more complicated because you are balancing interests of two individuals off of each other. So when I talk in this video, everything I'm saying is not really to do with abortion once a fetus is sentient. I'm more talking about not having kids in the first place, just simply not creating someone. You don't get to the stage of pregnancy. Cool, so now let's go into the two reasons that she obviously thinks are like stupid to refrain from creating someone, and that's climate change and the current state of the world. So let's take them one by one. Let's start with climate change. So obviously with climate change, not creating someone, this can come from like two key aspects. So the first one can be that you don't want to create someone because you think that they will contribute to exacerbating climate change. So this first one, I don't think is the best position for antinatalists to take. It may be a position that some antinatalists take. I don't think it's inherent in antinatalism, obviously, but I just don't think it's the best road to take. I think it's a very messy, very complicated topic that involves talking about a system, the climate, which is so complicated that we can't fully understand it as a species, let alone as individual human beings. So the impact of a specific person that you won't really know, having a child, how that's going to impact the climate in the short and the long term, I'm not sure that's something that you can really have an informed conversation on when you're speaking to someone about antinatalism. So I think it's best to avoid that topic of conversation and keep it purely on the ethics. And that brings us to the second thing that someone can mean when they talk about climate change is not creating a child exacerbating climate change, but not wanting to create someone because creating them will subject them to the suffering that climate change and other environmental issues could bring upon them. So this point I agree with. I think it only makes sense that if there is an impending or present environmental issue that is causing a lot of devastation in the world, and it can cause a lot of guaranteed harm and a lot of uncertainty as well, it makes sense to me not to put someone in the situation where they're going to be in harm's way, and the harm that's caused by that climatic change, when you don't need to. Like, why would you do that? That doesn't make sense to me. That unborn person is simply a figment of your imagination. They are not a real entity or individual that has an interest or desire to come into existence. They literally don't exist on any level to want to come into existence. And so creating them to then subject them to the potential horrors of climate change literally makes no sense to me. There's nothing in it for them, and they will suffer as a result if you create them from climate change. The thing I would add on to this, though, to the people who are sort of worried about their child suffering from climate change, is I don't understand why they're so fixated on climate change. Their argument is climate change is either happening or going to happen at some point in the future, and it's going to impact my child's life in a way where it will cause them to suffer. And therefore, I don't want to put someone else in a position where they suffer due to climate change. Why is the fact that the suffering comes from climate change relevant here? Climate change is just one way that someone can suffer, and it probably, for the child that this person creates now, it probably won't be the main cause of suffering. There are many other forms of like life generally has an innumerable amount of ways that you can suffer in it. Disease, trauma, rape, all of these sorts of things. The people that say that we should not be creating people and subjecting them to climate change, I think they really need to deeply reflect on, if that is the case, why should we be creating them generally for them to be subject to the potential horrors and guaranteed horrors of life? So now we get on to the current state of the world and why Ava thinks that it is narcissistic, degenerate and evil not to create someone because of the state of the world. Why would be my question. Like, surely there are states that the world can be in that Ava also would agree it is wrong to force someone into that. And so I'd have to ask her, what is it about this present world that she thinks makes it acceptable to force someone into it? And we've got to recognize that it is forcing someone into it. We can't ask them. We don't hand them a contract of life and say, look, here are the pros, here are the cons, sign on the dotted line. If you think it's worth it, then you can come into existence. No, we just force it on them. And in many situations, we force it on them without readily preparing for being able to raise them and really not adequately assessing the risks that are going to face them in life. But let's look at the world as it is at the moment. Okay, so you've got disease, war, harassment, exploitation, trauma, blackmail, mourning, heartbreak, etc., 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 etc. There are all these things present in the world. The richest people, the most successful people in the world can still have shit lives that may eventually lead them to end their existence. It doesn't seem like even the most powerful thing that gives someone privilege in the societies that we've built, which is money and influence, even those two things do not provide someone with even close to a guarantee of a life that even they would judge not to be worth starting. So most of the things I just listed are commonplace in even prosperous countries around the world. And so the thing I'd have to ask Ava is, why do you think it's degenerate not to force someone into that? Surely the degenerate thing to do, the evil thing to do, the narcissistic thing to do is to force someone into that. Looking at the world as it is, looking at the array of things that could and will happen to your child that are despicable and saying, yes, I'm going to force someone into that without being able to ask their permission, recognizing that they didn't exist to even want to come into it in the first place. The only reason I did it is because I wanted to create them. It's about me. Which of those options, forcing someone or not forcing someone, is the narcissistic, degenerate and evil thing to do? Which is not necessarily how I would frame it, that's just how she's framing it. But anyway, let's move on to the next bit where she starts talking about our ancestors. She essentially makes the point that we are being, I don't know, like whiny little bitches or something because our ancestors, essentially just people who existed before us and took actions that resulted in us being created now, they never had these thoughts, and so why do we have these thoughts? Well, first of all, they did have these thoughts. There are many people throughout history that were antinatalist. One famous example is Al-Mari. I will put a link in the description so people can find out more about him. But there are other people in history as well that are known, but obviously there will be many people who we don't know about, because obviously the vast majority of people in history never had anything written about them. They were just anonymous people who faded away in the depths of time. But anyway, let's get to the point she's making. So about our ancestors. So what is so essentially dumb about the point she's making? Well, the first thing is that, guess what? Our ancestors aren't here anymore. They don't have a vested interest in the decisions we make or the perspectives we have. Like, they aren't here anymore. Just like they don't know, because they don't exist anymore, that cars or planes or the internet exist. They are not going to know or care what route we take with ethics and whether we decide to also force someone into existence to be subject to the suffering that comes from climate change. Like, they're dead. They literally don't care. So trying to appeal to the sensitivities of someone who couldn't give less of a shit because they don't exist about what you do or someone else does doesn't make sense. Make an actual argument. Don't appeal to the sensitivities of someone who doesn't exist. The second thing that I think is so bafflingly dumb about what she said here is that she just basically assumes that our ancestors were right. She basically just says, we should stop doing this thing because our ancestors didn't do it. Okay, but our ancestors didn't do loads of things that they probably should have been doing. They also did loads of things that they probably shouldn't have been doing. Why are we using them as some sort of compass for our ethics? I mean, our ancestors engaged in slavery, rape, pillage, murder, theft, all of these sorts of things that Ava would not endorse, and yet now they're some sort of ethical yardstick for everyone else to measure their personal ethics on. Just because someone who existed before us took an action doesn't mean that they were correct. Like, they could have been mistaken over and over again. Just because an action is taken a lot of times and with great sincerity and conviction doesn't mean that it was ethically the right thing to do. So this appeal to ancestors sort of argument really doesn't wash with me. I don't think it makes sense. I think it's kind of done. But hopefully maybe Ava sees this, or other people that thought that she made some good points see this and they can see a different perspective, and that actually a lot of the things she said really don't make sense. So let me know what you thought of this one, and let me know your thoughts as well on what Ava said and what I said, and I will see you in the next one.